The penthouse on the 14th floor of Altair House had belonged to her grandmother for 31 years. Nana Cecilia had bought it in the early 90s, when the building was new and the neighborhood had not yet become the kind of neighborhood where people bought buildings. She had saved for 8 years before the purchase, keeping a ledger with handwritten columns in which she recorded every expense and every surplus with the same small, precise handwriting she used for everything, and had worked 2 jobs for 11 of the years that followed to pay it off, and had lived there alone for the last 17 of her life with the particular contentment of a woman who had built something entirely with her own hands and had no interest in explaining it to anyone. The walls held her choices. The particular yellow of the kitchen, which had been selected from 40 paint samples spread across the dining table over the course of a March Saturday, each one held up against the light from the window, each one assessed for the specific quality of warmth it would bring to a room she would spend her mornings in. The bookshelves that ran the entire length of the living room wall, floor to ceiling, built by a carpenter her grandmother had known since her 20s and had trusted with the measurement of every room she'd ever lived in. The books on those shelves, novels in 3 languages, travel essays, a complete collection of botanical illustration folios that had been assembled, piece by piece, over 40 years, from markets in 3 countries, from a single unforgettable auction she had attended on her own, and from one trip to Florence that her grandmother had described, in the way she described everything she loved, with absolute economy. Perfect, she had said. Every day of it, perfect. The window seat. Built into the alcove of the main bedroom window. Cushioned in a faded blue that had once been the color of deep water and had softened over the years into something quieter. Wide enough to sleep on, if you were not too particular about the logistics of it. Positioned perfectly, in the geometry of the building's face, to catch the western light in the late afternoon and the first suggestion of the city's nighttime illumination as dusk moved in. She had sat there with Nana Cecilia every Sunday of her childhood that she could manage. The arrangement had not been formal. Her parents had lived 3 hours away, far enough that a Sunday visit required intention, which meant it happened when Mara made it happen, which she had done from the age of 12 onward with a consistency that her mother had found, at various points, excessive, inconvenient, and finally, simply the thing that Mara did on Sundays. Her grandmother would read. Mara would sit opposite her, or beside her, or half-draped across the cushion with her feet up against the wall in the way her grandmother had never once asked her not to sit, which was itself a form of permission that she had understood only in retrospect as a very specific kind of love. She would watch the city below, which was endlessly, inexhaustibly interesting to a child who had grown up in a suburb 3 hours away and understood, from the first visit, that this apartment was the most extraordinary place she had ever been, not for the view, though the view was remarkable, but for the particular quality of silence inside it. The silence of a space that had been made by someone who knew exactly what they wanted and had spent years making it so. It felt like her. Not because she owned it. She had not known, then, that she would. Because it felt like the place her grandmother's hands had made, and her grandmother's hands were the same shape as hers. The same long fingers, the same particular way of being still at rest, the same ink stain on the right index finger that both of them had from a habit of holding pens slightly too tightly, and her grandmother's way of being in a room, which was quiet and complete and entirely unimpressed by urgency, was the thing that people most often reached for when they were trying to say something about Mara that they could not quite put into direct language. She is very like Cecilia. This was said at family gatherings, in the particular tone reserved for observations that could be compliments or explanations depending on who was listening. In the family she had grown up in, it was rarely a compliment. Her grandmother had died on a Wednesday in February. She had been 81 years old. She had been, according to the hospice nurse who had stayed the full night with her, completely at peace in the last hours, reading until her eyes would no longer focus, then putting the book aside without drama, without apparent fear, in the manner of someone who has done all the things they intended to do and is simply completing the final item on a very long list. The will had been read the following Friday. Her mother and father had driven up from the suburb. Her sister Vanessa had come with her then-fiancé James, who had stood slightly to the side of everything in the way of people attending events they'd been brought to rather than chosen to come to. 3 aunts, 2 cousins, a solicitor named Mr. Hewitt who wore a 3-piece suit and read aloud in the voice of a man who has delivered both good and devastating news so many times that he has found an equidistant tone that serves both occasions. Her parents had come expecting something. Mara had come expecting nothing, which was the way she had learned to approach most things in her family, as a person who had trained herself, through long practice, not to develop expectations that would require specific people to be different than they were. She arrived at the solicitor's office with her grandmother's key in her coat pocket, which she had been given by the hospice staff when she had been the one, 3 days ago, who had gone to the apartment to collect a few things her grandmother had asked to have with her at the end, and which she had not yet returned because she had not yet been ready to. She had been wrong to expect nothing. The penthouse, the apartment with the yellow kitchen and the 31 years of her grandmother's choices built into every wall and surface and shelf, had been left to her. Entirely. Without condition. Without division. There was a letter. Mr. Hewitt read it in the same equidistant tone, but by the end of the second paragraph, something in the room had shifted, the way rooms shift when a document stops being administrative and becomes, unexpectedly, personal. The letter said 3 things. That Nana Cecilia had known, for some years, which of her grandchildren would take care of it, not the building, not the property value, not the investment it represented, but the specific and irreplaceable collection of choices she had spent 31 years making inside it. That she had chosen accordingly, with full confidence, without apology. And that the window seat was to remain exactly where it was. Mara had cried in the car on the way home. Not from grief alone. Grief was there, the particular hollow quality of a world that now contained no Nana Cecilia in it, which was a world that made less sense than the previous version and would require significant adjustment to navigate. But underneath the grief, or threaded through it, was something more complex and harder to name, the overwhelming quality of being seen. Of being chosen not despite your quietness, not despite your competence, not despite your particular way of managing things without announcing that you were managing them, but because of all of it. Because someone had looked at her, fully and without condition, and had decided, you. Her mother had called that evening. The call lasted 12 minutes. It should have been split, her mother said. You know that, Mara. Between you and Vanessa. That's what made sense. Nana was always sentimental, she never thought practically, and now your sister is getting married in 3 months and she and James are going to need. Nana left it to who she wanted to leave it to, Mara said. To who she was fondest of, her mother said, with the particular tone she used to make statements sound like neutral observations. That's not the same as to who needed it. She wasn't a pension fund, Mara said. She was a person. She made a choice. Mara. No, and she heard herself, even as she said it, the steadiness in her own voice, which surprised her, which had not been there 6 months ago, which had been building, she now understood, from some accumulation of Sunday mornings on a window seat above the city. I'm not giving it up. It was hers. She gave it to me. That's the end. Her mother had said several more things after that. Mara had listened to them without revision. When the call ended, she had sat in her small rented flat, 1 bedroom, road noise, the particular beige of a wall that has been painted so many times by so many different landlords that it has become its own category of color, and she had held her grandmother's key and thought about yellow kitchens. That had been 3 months ago. In 3 months, she had moved into the penthouse. She had not changed anything. Not yet. She was not ready to change anything. She lived inside her grandmother's choices like a person staying in a room that belongs to someone whose presence you are still adjusting to the absence of, not uneasily, not as a guest, but with the specific care of someone who understands that some things are still in the process of becoming theirs. She took coffee on the window seat every morning before work. She read there on Sundays. She was beginning to understand with growing and rather astonishing clarity, the most at home she had ever been in her entire life. And then came the wedding. Vanessa had been planning it for 2 years, which was, Mara privately thought, approximately 18 months longer than necessary for an event that was, in its essential structure, a very expensive lunch followed by dancing. She kept this thought entirely to herself, which was a skill she had developed so completely over 3 decades that she was not always certain anymore where the thought ended and the diplomacy began. She was the maid of honor. She had been asked in a phone call that also contained the phrase, "I know it's a lot to ask," in a tone that communicated that this was not, in fact, a question. She had accepted. Of course she had accepted. There was a pattern in her family. There had always been a pattern, in which what was said and what was meant occupied slightly different registers, and the gap between them was filled, reliably, by Mara, who had learned from a young age that filling it was the fastest path to a certain kind of peace. Not the peace of resolution. The peace of postponement. The peace of a situation that has been managed rather than addressed. Vanessa was 3 years older than her and had been beautiful her whole life in the specific way of people who are told they are beautiful before they have developed the framework to assess the information critically. She was not unkind. That was important to say, and to mean. Vanessa was not unkind. She was simply located, positioned, from childhood, at the center of the family's attention in a way that had become so natural to everyone involved that it had long since stopped being a choice and had become simply the geography of the family. Vanessa was the center. Mara was the perimeter. The perimeter held everything up. The center got all the light. James was a financial analyst from a family 2 tax brackets above theirs. He was pleasant, competent, genuinely in love with Vanessa in the way that certain calm and steady people fall in love with people who require more managing, with patience, with dedication, with the particular piece of a person who has found something that needs them. The wedding had been calibrated to communicate success. The venue was a converted manor house 40 minutes outside the city. The flowers were ivory and dusty rose. 180 guests. A string quartet for the ceremony. A band for the reception. A wedding planner who had worked with the family for 14 months and communicated primarily with Vanessa, occasionally with their mother, and with Mara whenever something needed doing that fell outside the wedding planner's specific contractual scope. Which was, it had turned out, quite a lot of things. Mara had addressed envelopes on 4 separate weekends. She had organized the hen weekend, 2 nights in the countryside, 7 women, a booking that had required 6 phone calls and 2 site visits. She had managed the dress fitting and the backup dress fitting, when Vanessa had decided at 11 weeks before the wedding that the first choice no longer aligned with the vision she developed in the interim, which had required a second round of appointments, alterations, and the management of the original dressmaker's feelings on the subject. She had rewritten the rehearsal dinner seating plan twice, once when the original configuration was reviewed by her mother and determined to have placed James's family incorrectly relative to the head table, and once when 2 guests had a falling out of unknown origin that made their proximity to each other inadvisable. She had done all of this from the penthouse. On the window seat, mostly, with the city below and her grandmother's tea and the botanical prince keeping her company in the evenings. And she had noted, somewhere in the middle of it all, that she had not minded the tasks themselves. She was organized. She was competent. She found, in the actual execution of complex logistical problems, a genuine satisfaction that she was not certain was shared by everyone. What she had minded, what she had noticed she minded, which was not quite the same thing, was the invisibility of it. The way the tasks were assumed rather than asked for. The way the completion of them was received not with gratitude but with simple continuation, the way you turn on a light without thanking the electricity. She had been thinking about this more, since the penthouse. Since being chosen. She arrived at the manor on the morning of the wedding at 7:15 a.m., as instructed, with her dress and her shoes and the small emergency kit she had assembled independently and without being asked, safety pins, clear nail polish, anti-nausea tablets, double-sided tape, 2 extra sets of tights in Vanessa's size, a miniature sewing kit, and a folded piece of paper with the wedding planner's emergency number and the number of the backup florist written in her own handwriting because she had learned, from experience, that in emergency situations the brain does not always cooperate with the memory. Vanessa was already in hair and makeup. She was running 43 minutes ahead of schedule, which was explained by the look of controlled anxiety she wore underneath the makeup artist's patient attention, by the fact that she had not slept as well as she had hoped and had decided at 5 a.m. that the only solution was to begin. "You look pale," Vanessa said, when Mara walked in. "Good morning," Mara said. "I'm serious, you look tired. Have you been sleeping?" "I've been working on your seating plan at 11 o'clock at night," Mara said, with a mildness that was a choice. "So not always, no." Vanessa's makeup artist made a small, carefully neutral sound and continued what she was doing. "The seating plan was your job," Vanessa said. "Yes," Mara agreed. "I know. I just mean, you should manage your time better. You can't look exhausted in the photos." Mara set her bag down. She looked at her sister in the mirror. Vanessa was looking at her own reflection, which was not unusual, and did not seem to register the specific quality of the silence that followed her last sentence. "Your dress is beautiful," Mara said. It was. That part was true. The morning was long in the texture that mornings develop when you are running on insufficient sleep and simultaneously managing someone else's emotional weather. There were small crises at intervals, each one requiring the particular skill of rapid triage, the determination of whether a problem was real or felt, and the different approach each category required. The bridesmaid with the wrong shoes, real. Solved with a phone call to the bridesmaid's sister, who drove a pair over in 40 minutes. The buttonhole made fractionally too large for James's lapel, felt, primarily. Resolved with a small adjustment and the information that no one in the room or the venue would be close enough to the groom's chest to evaluate the buttonhole's fit. The fascinator. Her mother's fascinator had been correct at 9 a.m. By 10:30, it was not sitting right, which was a determination her mother had arrived at independently and which she communicated not to the wedding planner but to Mara, who spent 15 minutes with 3 other women trying various angles and configurations before concluding, collectively, that the original angle had been correct and that what had changed was not the fascinator but her mother's relationship to it. Her mother, whose name was Diane, had looked at her during this process with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say something. She had decided not to. Mara had noted this. Her mother's silences were never empty. They were storage. Whatever was in there would come out later. Mara filed it and returned to the morning's tasks. The ceremony itself was held in the manor's chapel, a small, original structure attached to the side of the main building, stone walls and high windows and the smell of old wood and something floral that the florist had managed to distribute without being obvious about it. Mara stood at the altar with the bouquet and watched her sister walk down the aisle on their father's arm. Her father was Richard. He was 61 and looked, from a distance, very much the part of a man giving his eldest daughter away at a country manor, proud, tearful in a controlled manner, dressed in the morning suit he had rented with some deliberateness and which fit him as well as rented morning suits fit anyone, which was to say adequately. He was a man who had built his idea of himself very early and maintained it carefully. He was not complicated in the ways that complicated people are complicated. He was complicated in the simpler, harder way of a person who has never had to revise his fundamental understanding of himself and therefore has never developed the tools for revision. He looked at Mara, briefly, as he passed her at the altar. She looked back. She watched him deliver Vanessa to James with the specific expression of a man completing something important, and she felt, watching it, the mix of things she felt at most events involving her family: genuine happiness for the parts of it that were genuinely happy, grief that arrived in small and unexpected waves, and underneath it all, the quiet, steady weariness of a person who has been load-bearing for so long that they have nearly forgotten what it feels like to be simply present rather than useful. She did not cry during the ceremony. Two aunts commented on this afterward, independently, and in the same tone, remarking on it as a kind of composure, which it was not. It was exhaustion. But the distinction was one she had no particular interest in making to anyone at a wedding. The reception moved through its required hours. Speeches that had been written with the intention of being 20 minutes and ran to 35. Food that was genuinely excellent and eaten, in Mara's case, largely while standing because there was always something that required her attention, and sitting down was a kind of commitment the evening had not yet offered her the room to make. A seating arrangement that had been agonized over for 6 weeks and which, in practice, produced 2 awkward table configurations and one unexpectedly wonderful pairing between James's grandmother and a distant cousin on Vanessa's side who turned out to share an interest in competitive chess. Mara managed the evening. She noted the things that needed noting. She adjusted the things that needed adjusting. She directed the wedding photographer to the family groups that her mother had specified and which the photographer's artistic sensibility had led him to slightly deprioritize in favor of candid moments that were, she had to admit, the more beautiful photographs. She confirmed with the events manager that the car for Vanessa and James was arriving at 11:45 rather than midnight, which had been amended 6 days ago but not communicated successfully to the venue. She did all of this. And once, briefly, across the main hall, when the band had started on its 4th set and the guests had reached the stage of an evening where most of them were several drinks past their initial social ambitions, she stopped and looked around the room and thought, I have been doing this all my life. Not this specifically. Not wedding reception management at a country manor. But this. The invisible architecture of other people's important days. The work that made things run and was never named because naming it would require acknowledging that it was work and not simply the natural consequence of being a person with a particular temperament. She was still thinking about this when her father appeared at the edge of the dance floor. 9:15 p.m. He was very slightly flushed from the champagne and from the particular warmth of a room that had been running on collective emotion for 5 hours. He wore the expression she recognized from 2 other moments in her life, the expression he wore when he had already made a decision and was now simply delivering it to the person it most affected. We need to talk, he said. I know, she said. She had known since February. She had known, if she was honest, since the phone call the night after the will was read. She had known it the way you know an approaching weather system. Not the specific form it would take, but the certainty of its arrival. They moved to the far edge of the room, away from the nearest tables, near the double doors that led to the corridor. Her mother appeared, because her mother always appeared when these conversations needed a second voice. She moved with the practiced ease of someone arriving at a position she had held in readiness. The apartment, her father said. The penthouse, Mara said. Not to correct him for the pleasure of correcting him. To be exact. Because exactness mattered, in this conversation, in ways she was only now articulating. The penthouse, he agreed. Your grandmother left it to you. He said it not as acknowledgement but as the establishing of a premise he was about to qualify. And we've given you time. We've been patient. We understood that you needed to settle and that it wasn't the right moment to have a practical conversation. It was never going to be the right moment for this particular practical conversation, she said. Her father continued as though she hadn't spoken. This was habitual rather than malicious. He simply had a conversational framework in which her interjections were factored as minor weather, to be noted and moved past. Vanessa and James need to think about where they're going to live, he said. They've been in that flat. It's a one-bedroom, Mara. A penthouse with 4 bedrooms and a study, sitting with one person in it, while your sister starts her marriage in a one-bedroom flat in Zone 3. I live there, she said. One person, he said. That doesn't make it less mine. No one is saying it's not yours, her mother said, with the tone she used to introduce exactly the thing she was saying. We're saying that when you think about the family as a whole, as a unit. Nana didn't leave it to the family as a unit, Mara said. She left it to me. Specifically. By name. With a letter. Nana was sentimental, her mother said. 3 months. The same sentence. The same delivery. The same tone that placed her grandmother's deliberate, documented, considered choice in the category of things that were too emotional to be reliable. Something in Mara's chest tightened and then, unexpectedly, released. She was not sentimental, she said. Her voice was very quiet. She was exact. She kept ledgers. She chose 40 paint samples before she picked the kitchen color. She built that apartment over 31 years with her own money and her own decisions, and she knew exactly what she wanted to do with it. What she did was not sentimental. It was precise. And it is mine. The last 3 words fell into the space between them with a weight that surprised all 3 of them, she thought, because she had never, in 32 years, placed a sentence in quite that specific a position. Had never made the claim that plainly. Had never allowed what was hers to simply be hers without immediate qualification. Her father's jaw tightened. You're doing this at your sister's wedding, he said. You brought this conversation to me, she said. At my sister's wedding. I would have preferred not to have it here. And yet here we are, he said. Yes, she said. Here we are. Her mother turned away. That specific pivot that preceded the summoning of a third-party mediator, the movement of a woman who had spent a lifetime managing conflict by redistribution rather than resolution. Her father did not turn away. He looked at her with the expression that had appeared exactly twice in her life before this moment. Once when she was 16 and had told him she didn't want to study accounting. Once when she was 23 and had declined a Christmas that would have cost her annual leave she couldn't afford. The expression of a man whose internal model of reality has encountered a refusal it has no protocol for. You are being selfish, he said. You are sitting in an apartment with 4 bedrooms because you want to feel special. Because you want to feel chosen. Because you have always, he stopped. He started again, and his voice had the quality of something that had found a channel it had been looking for. You have always needed to make everything about what Mara wants. What Mara feels. Your sister is starting her life and you want to hold on to a building because it makes you feel like Nana loved you best. The sentence went into her like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. Not because it was true. But because it reached, with the specific accuracy that only people who have known you your whole life can reach, for the thing you have been afraid was true, and it found it, and held it up, and told her, see, here, this is what you are, this is why you are doing this, this is the small and unworthy core of the thing you've been calling principle. She stood with it for exactly as long as it took her to understand that it was not true. That she was not keeping the penthouse because she needed to feel loved best. She was keeping it because she was loved. Fully. Completely. By someone who had known her exactly, who had sat beside her on a Sunday window seat for 20 years and had seen her, all of her, the quiet and the competence and the particular way she held a pen too tightly and the way she looked at cities from above, and who had said, with full legal documentation and a letter and the instruction that the window seat was to remain exactly where it was. That was not sentimentality. That was her grandmother knowing who she was. That was the truest thing anyone had ever done for her. "No," she said. Her father went still. "No. I am not keeping it because I need to feel special. I am keeping it because she gave it to me and she meant to, and it is mine. And I am done, I am finished, with the conversation that pretends otherwise." What happened next took 2 seconds. She would replay those 2 seconds many times in the weeks that followed, not in the way of someone who cannot let something go, but in the way of someone who is trying to understand exactly what had been revealed, not just about her father, but about the architecture of everything. His hand came up. And he slapped her. It was not hard. That detail would attach itself to the event and become, afterward, the one she returned to most. Not hard, meaning no physical mark, meaning the people in the nearest radius who turned at the sound of it could have, if they needed to, categorized it as something else. Misheard. Misread. But she had not misheard. The sound was the sound of a hand connecting with a face, and the feeling was the specific feeling of a boundary being crossed that changes, irrevocably, the shape of the thing it was a boundary of. She did not fall. She did not make a sound. She stood exactly where she had been standing, and the only external sign of what had happened was the slight involuntary lift of her hand toward the left side of her face, which she made herself lower, with a deliberateness that cost her more than she would have been able to estimate, back to her side. Her father was looking at his own hand. His expression was the expression of a person who has broken through the membrane of who they believed they were and found something on the other side they had not expected to find. He had not expected to do this. She could see that. The knowledge did not make it smaller. Her mother had gone absolutely still in the way of someone whose management systems have all encountered the same error simultaneously. Around them, a 10-foot radius of quiet that had opened in the noise of the reception like a door. Mara looked at her father. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not be spent in a room that was not going to give it back, in a moment that was not going to hold it properly, among people who were not equipped to receive it. She had learned, over a long time, the particular economy of silence in situations where speech is a gift you cannot afford to give. She turned. She walked. Not running. Not performing composure. Simply moving, through the edge of the reception, through the radius of people who had noticed and were in the process of deciding what they had noticed, through the double doors and into the corridor beyond. The corridor was cooler. She followed it without a specific destination in the way she had always moved through situations that exceeded their space, forward, away, toward whatever came next. At the end of the corridor, a door. The door opened onto a side terrace that overlooked the manor's gardens. The gardens were dark at 9:30 p.m. in November, and they smelled of cut grass and cold air and the particular freshness of an evening that had been warmer than the month suggested and was now correcting itself. She went to the railing. She put her hands on the stone. She breathed. She was shaking. She noticed this with the detached clarity of someone who has divided themselves temporarily into the observer and the observed. The body was doing one thing, and she was watching it from a small distance, noting the physiological accounting for an event her mind was still in the process of receiving. She stood there. She breathed. She did not cry, not because she thought she shouldn't, but because she was not certain, if she started, that she would be able to do it quietly, and she was not ready to do it any other way. The door behind her opened. She did not turn. She expected many people. Her mother. A bridesmaid. One of the aunts who was always first on the scene of a family difficulty with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity to be needed. She expected, in the most charitable version, Vanessa, though she did not expect Vanessa, because Vanessa was dancing, and Vanessa's wedding evening was the one thing in this entire year that Mara had genuinely wanted to be uncomplicated. She did not expect him. She had seen him once during the evening, once, from across the main hall, in the way that you occasionally notice people at large events without context or intention, simply as a presence that the eye returns to briefly and then moves past. He had been at a table near the far windows. Dark suit. Not the kind you hire for an occasion, or choose from a rack, the kind that has been constructed for a specific person by someone whose job it is to understand what a person's clothing is supposed to communicate. He had been speaking to two men across the table with the ease of someone for whom most conversations are a formality rather than an effort. She had not thought about him again. And yet here he was. He came to stand beside her at the railing, not close, not intrusive, the precise distance of someone who understands that proximity requires permission and is, for the moment, requesting rather than assuming it. He did not say anything. This was the first extraordinary thing. Every person who had ever followed her into a moment of distress, and there had been some, over the years, because she was the kind of person who rarely made her distress visible enough to attract company, but occasionally someone was close enough, had said something immediately. The reflexive verbal offering that people produce when silence feels like negligence. Are you all right? What happened? Do you need anything? Can I? Shall I? Is there someone? He said nothing. He stood beside her and looked at the dark garden below, and he was simply present, in the way of someone who understood, without being told, that presence was the only gift the moment had room for. She looked at him. He had the quality of stillness that certain people carry through rooms, not the stillness of someone containing something, but the stillness of someone who has nothing to contain because they are entirely, precisely where they intended to be. After a while, he said, "The stone's cold. If you keep your hands there much longer it'll be uncomfortable." She looked at her hands. Pressed flat against the railing. Cold, as he said. "Thank you," she said. And it came out far more genuine than she intended, not as courtesy but as the first honest response she'd given to anything in the last hour. Because it was the first thing anyone had said to her that was about her, and only her, and nothing else. "The terrace door sticks," he said. "The trick is to push from the lower left. Not the center." She looked at him. He was still looking at the garden. "You're not going to ask if I'm all right," she said. "You're not all right," he said. Asking you to confirm it out loud seemed like the kind of thing that doesn't help. She exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind with more than air in it. The kind that releases something that has been held at tension for longer than the current moment. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You were inside." "Yes. You followed me out." "I saw what happened," he said. And then, after a pause, "and I thought, someone should know where you are." She turned to look at him fully for the first time. She registered this without quite intending to, not what she would have assembled if she had tried to construct a picture of the kind of person who followed a woman onto a cold terrace at a wedding and stood beside her without demanding a conversation. The face was serious in its fundamental structure, the kind of serious that comes not from gravity of expression but from bone, the architecture of a face that doesn't lend itself to performing lightness. But the eyes, when he turned and met hers, were not unkind. They were, in fact, the most specific eyes she had ever looked into, specific in the way of people who see things directly, without the buffer of interpretation, and who had been doing so long enough that it has become a kind of inevitability. "My father hit me," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. Only that it was true, and that the truth required somewhere to go that was not inside herself. "I know," he said. "He's not," she stopped. Tried again. "He hasn't done that before. He's not a person who does that." "That doesn't make it smaller," he said. "No," she said. It doesn't. A silence settled between them that was not empty. The apartment, she said, after a while. The word came out with more weight than she intended and she let it stay that way. My grandmother left me an apartment. A penthouse, in the city. And my family, my parents, they want me to give it up for my sister. Because my sister just got married and she needs more space. And I said no. And that was why, she stopped. That was the reason. For the conversation. For all of it. You don't have to explain it, he said. I know, she said. I want to. I want someone to know the actual reason, tonight, or I'm going to go home and it will exist only inside me and that's not. She stopped again. Looked at the garden. That's not sufficient. He waited. She chose me, Mara said. My grandmother. She had other grandchildren. She chose me. And it was the first time, in 32 years, that anyone in my family looked at me and said, not because you're useful, not because Vanessa has already been given the thing and there's nothing left, not because you'll manage well with whatever is left over, but simply, you. I want you to have this. You specifically. She was quiet for a moment. And they want me to give it up, she said. Because my sister needs more space. And in my family, when my sister needs something, what my sister needs becomes what the family needs. And what I need has always been, adjustable. The last word came out with an edge she hadn't intended and didn't retract. He said, after a pause, how long have you been the one who manages things? She looked at him sharply. What? In there. A slight turn of his head toward the building. I watched you for part of the evening. You were tracking everything, the photographer, the seating, your sister's schedule. You were managing the event as well as anyone on the catering staff. Without being paid for it. A pause. A long time, she said. And who manages things for you? The question arrived without weight or agenda. Just the question, placed in the air between them with the neutrality of someone who genuinely wants to know. She looked at him. No one, she said. He nodded, as though she had confirmed something. My name is Dante, he said. Mara, she said. The door opened. Her father came through it. He had, in the elapsed time, rebuilt the version of himself he kept for situations requiring a managed exterior. His jacket was straightened. His expression was controlled in the way of a man who has done something that exceeded the occasion and is now employing every resource available to him to return the occasion to ground he recognizes. He stepped onto the terrace. He looked at Mara. He looked at the man beside her. Something shifted in his face, the micro-adjustment of a person who has walked into a room they assumed they understood and found it arranged differently than expected. He read the man beside Mara the way certain people read rooms, quickly, without appearing to, and with a result that was visible only as a slight recalibration of bearing. Mara, he said. Come inside. We should finish our conversation. She said nothing. She had nothing left for this. She had spent 32 years filling every silence directed at her by her family. She had given that silence everything she had. The account was empty. Dante spoke. Quietly. He always spoke quietly, she would learn, because he had never needed volume. Volume is the tool of people who are not certain they already have the room. He had never been uncertain about that. Mr. Dot, a deliberate pause. I don't believe we've been introduced. Her father looked at him. The look lasted approximately 2 seconds. Richard Callahan. Mara's father. Dante Vitale. The name carried no emphasis. It didn't need any. A guest. Something happened in her father's face at the name. It was not fear, exactly. It was the expression of a person who has been keeping a mental index of certain names, names that exist in a specific register, that are spoken in lowered voices in specific contexts, and who has just heard one of those names used in the first person, by the person the name belongs to, at a distance of approximately 4 feet. "I don't think your daughter is ready to come inside," Dante said. "I think the conversation you're hoping to finish should probably wait for a setting where it can be had properly." This 1 foot, a very slight movement of his head toward the manor windows, is visible from several angles that may not be ideal for the family of the bride. Her father looked at the windows. He looked at Mara. He looked at Dante Vitale. He said nothing further. He went inside. The door closed behind him. Mara let out a breath that she had been managing since her father had stepped onto the terrace. "Dante Vitale," she said. "James's business contact." "Something like that," he said. "My father recognized your name." "Most people in certain contexts know it," he said. "What contexts?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone deciding not which truth to tell but which form of it is appropriate for a terrace in November at 9:40 p.m. at a wedding. "I have various business interests," he said. "Some of them are well documented. Some of them are understood rather than documented. People with your father's background in this city have usually encountered at least one of the latter categories." She looked at him. "Are you dangerous?" she said. "To you?" he said, without hesitation. "No. That's a careful qualifier." "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at the garden. She thought about her grandmother's apartment. The window seat. The 40 paint samples and the chosen yellow. The botanical prints from Florence. The key that was now on her grandmother's keyring that was now her keyring. She thought about the word, adjustable. She thought about what it would mean to be, for the first time, unadjustable. "What do I do now?" she said. "Not tonight. Generally." "Tonight," he said, "you go back inside. You finish the evening, because you promised it to your sister and that promise belongs to her and not to what your parents did with it. You manage it the way you've managed everything, because that's who you are and you're not going to become someone different at 9:40 on a terrace just because the evening went badly." She listened. "And then you go home," he said. "To the apartment your grandmother gave you. You sit in whatever part of it was hers that mattered most. And you hold the simple truth that the only person whose opinion about that apartment had any legal or moral relevance has already given her opinion. In writing. With a letter. And that everything else is noise." She held those sentences carefully. "The window seat," she said. "Is that where she used to sit?" "Yes. We both did. On Sundays." A pause. "Then that," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "The sticking door," she said. "You made that up." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had no word for yet, the close cousin of amusement, the thing that lives in people who have seen enough that very little surprises them, and who find the rare thing that does surprise them more interesting than alarming. "Because someone should know where you are," he said. "And because you were standing on a cold terrace with your hands pressed flat against stone, and no one had checked whether you were cold. And because the person who manages everything deserves, at minimum, 5 minutes where nothing is required of them." A pause. "And because I wanted to." The last 4 words arrived with a directness that she received not with alarm but with the specific quality of attention that she gave to true things, turning them slightly, considering them from different angles, filing them somewhere she would return to. She went back inside. She managed the final 2 hours of the evening. She coordinated the cake cutting. She tracked the photographer. She confirmed the car. She spoke to 3 aunts and was introduced to James's colleague's wife and declined, politely, the offer of a very late glass of champagne from a man she didn't know who seemed to believe that 11 p.m. at a wedding was a reasonable time to begin a conversation. She did all of it. And twice, across the room, she looked toward the table near the windows and found Dante Vitale already looking at her. He did not look away when she looked. He did not perform not looking. He simply looked, with the quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as specific to him, the look of a person who has already decided something and is simply allowing the thing he has decided to become visible. She looked away first. Both times. Both times, something in her chest registered the looking away as a choice rather than a reflex, which was its own kind of information. Vanessa and James left at 11:43 in the hired car. Vanessa hugged her at the door, briefly, warmly, with the particular quality of a hug from someone who is too happy in this moment to process the complexity of the evening and who will, perhaps, circle back to it later. Perhaps not. Mara had learned not to predict her sister's circles. "Thank you," Vanessa said. "For everything. For all of it. You know I couldn't have done today without you." Mara held her sister for a moment. "I know," she said. She took a taxi back to the city. She let herself into the penthouse with the key that had been her grandmother's and was now hers. The building was quiet. The lift was slow. She stood in it and looked at the floor numbers and did not think about anything specific. The apartment was dark until she turned the kitchen light on. The yellow was very soft in the nighttime. It had a quality at this hour that was different from the morning, warmer, more contained, like a color that knew when it was needed most. She made tea. Her grandmother's blend. The one she had found in the cupboard and had continued buying without conscious decision, because it was what the kitchen contained and it was what the evenings required. She carried it to the window seat. She sat. The city was below her in the dark, all of it, in every direction, doing what cities do at midnight, which is to say continuing without any reference to the singular events occurring within it. She found this, as she had always found it, steadying. She sat there for a while. Her face no longer ached, which was something. Her phone showed 4 messages when she picked it up. One from Vanessa, "Arrived safe, thank you again X." One from a bridesmaid, "Just checking on you, tonight was a lot." 2 from numbers she had saved. One from a number she didn't have saved. She opened it. It read, "The tea helps. DV." She looked at that for a long time. She typed, "How did you know about the tea?" The response was immediate, which told her something she filed carefully, "You mentioned your grandmother." "I inferred." She typed, "You're very attentive for someone I met on a terrace." A brief pause. Then, "I'm attentive regardless of setting." The terrace was incidental. She set the phone on the cushion beside her. She picked it up. She typed, "Thank you for coming out there. You didn't have to." A longer pause. Then, "No. I didn't have to." She waited. Then, "You would have been all right either way." She typed, "I know. But I didn't have to be alone on a cold terrace while I figured that out." The pause this time lasted longer. Then, simply, "No. You didn't." She looked at the city. She looked at the botanical prints on the far wall, the ones from Florence, and the ones from the markets, and the one her grandmother had bid for at an auction she'd attended on her own on a Tuesday afternoon in her 70s, which had arrived wrapped in brown paper and had been hung with some ceremony in the space her grandmother had been saving for it for 3 years. She looked at the yellow kitchen through the open door. She thought about her grandmother sitting exactly here, on this cushion, above this city, for 17 years. Reading, and watching, and being entirely, completely at home in the life she had built with her own hands. She thought about what it meant to be chosen. She thought about what it meant to be specific to someone, to be the person someone looked at and saw, not as useful, not as manageable, not as the one who would take whatever was left after the primary distribution had been made, but as themselves. As exactly themselves. She thought about a terrace and a man who had followed her out and had not said anything unnecessary. Her phone showed a message: the Marchetti restaurant has a terrace. The door works from both sides. In case it comes up. She looked at that message for a long time. She looked at the city. She typed, "Is that an invitation?" The response, immediate, "Yes." She looked at the word. She typed, "Then I should probably know which door to go to." A pause. "Then, I'll meet you at the front. You won't need to worry about the doors." She sat on the window seat and held her phone and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who was met at the front, who didn't have to navigate the doors, or manage the entrance, or figure out in advance which surface was going to cause problems. Who simply arrived, and was met. The city was enormous and quiet below her. The tea was nearly finished. Somewhere in the city, at a distance she didn't know and hadn't asked for, a man named Dante Vitale had sent a message that was technically about a restaurant and was actually about something else entirely, and she had answered it in kind, and the exchange was sitting in her phone like a small, warm thing that had not yet declared its full nature. She was 32 years old. She had a penthouse that smelled of her grandmother's books and the botanical prints from Florence, and a yellow kitchen that had taken 40 samples, and a window seat that had been specifically instructed to remain exactly where it was. She had a family that had asked her, tonight, to be less than she was, and she had said no, and the no had cost her the specific price that no costs in families like hers, and she had come home and paid the cost, and she was still here. Still on the window seat. Still holding the tea. Still exactly herself. She was not going to give up the apartment. She was not going to give up the window seat, or the prints, or the yellow kitchen, or the Sunday mornings, or any of the specific and irreplaceable things that made the place hers and made her the person her grandmother had looked at and chosen. She was not going to adjust. Not anymore. Not for this. She set the mug on the window seat beside her and looked at the city for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. She typed, "What time?" The answer came back immediately, as though he had been waiting for exactly that question. 7. "I'll be outside." She put the phone face down on the cushion beside her. She looked at the city one more time. And then, for the first time since 7:15 that morning, she allowed herself to be exactly where she was, in the place that was hers, on a window seat above a city that didn't know her name, in the life that was beginning, in the small, uncertain and completely unadjustable way of things that have finally found their shape, to belong entirely to her.